Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I am tired, I am weak, and I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand.
Welcome to a special edition of Gospel Truth with Andrew Womack, a teaching ministry that focuses on God's unconditional love and grace. On today's broadcast, Andrew is joined by David and Tim Barton as they discuss America's systemically anti-racist heritage. And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to another very special edition of the Gospel Truth. I've got my good friends David and Tim Barton here with me in Wall Builders Ministry. I tell you, they are just a national treasure, the wisdom that they've gotten. What a blessing for them to make time to come and be with us. And the reason I asked them to be with us is because we're approaching Thanksgiving, and that's my favorite holiday. We've got so much to be thankful for. I personally believe you can check your spiritual pulse by how thankful you are. If you are just focused on problems and always interceding and struggling with things, I tell you, you aren't spiritually healthy. The Scripture says you're supposed to make your requests known with thanksgiving. And so I think Thanksgiving is powerful, and to celebrate one day a year where we just do this is a wonderful thing. And yet, because of all of the riots and the wokeness and the cancel culture and stuff, there are people today that are confused and they honestly don't feel that they have anything to be thankful for. And Tim, I think it was yesterday on our program that you said that some people are even advocating having a day of mourning instead of a day of thanksgiving.
Correct.
Man, it's a good thing I'm not God, or I'd just turn them into a pile of ashes. That is so
you and Moses,
ungodly.
where Moses said, hey, kill these people, and God said, yeah, right.
Sons of Thunder too.
Yeah.
That's terrible. So anyway, we have been trying to counter all of the lies, and it is lies. It's. I think Tim said that it was ignorance of American history. I believe a lot of it is intentional.
Sure.
Like, Prentice Cullors, I believe it is, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter. She said she's a trained Marxist.
Right.
And I mean, they are out to destroy this nation. So there may be some people that have been sucked up into this, but the leadership of this stuff is literally out to destroy this nation and rewrite our history. So we're trying to change that. So anyway, yesterday, I've talked too much already. I'm going to turn you loose. But yesterday, we were just basically saying that America is not systemically racist. We started touching on the 1619 Project. But before we get back into that, let me just turn you guys loose again. They're saying that all of our founding fathers, these colonies, everything were based on slavery. We even had one, was it a congressman that said that America invented slavery?
U.S. Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia on the floor of the Senate said America did not inherit slavery, America invented slavery.
Created it.
Speak to that. Is that accurate?
We joke about the fact his world history teacher is either highly embarrassed or is the most incompetent teacher ever.
Is that the same one that honestly said that if they keep building on Guam that the thing
No,
is
that's different. That was a U.S. congressman. That was a U.S. congressman that Guam was going to tip with all the military bases on one side and all the people drowned.
Yeah, that was
because the
Congressman
island
Hank
flipped over.
Johnson from Georgia. But it's the same level of ignorance.
It is. That's what I was going to say.
It's crazy what we're seeing in America today. And this is where, as you pointed out, there are leaders who are very intentional. We during the summer, we do a lot of programs for college students, and we tell them in life, you generally deal with two kinds of people, the intentional and the ignorant. And the reason it's important to distinguish is where Jesus talks about don't cast your pearls before swine. Well, if you're working with ignorant people, you can teach, you can educate the ignorant. But the intentional, you're casting pearls before swine because they don't care what's true. They care about their agenda and what they're trying to accomplish. And this is what we're seeing in America today, a lot of this Marxist ideology, which is why even at Thanksgiving, the time that we ought to be the most thankful, we're being told, no, we shouldn't be thankful. We should have a day of mourning, which is utterly ludicrous on every level. But part of it's based on this bad, false history and ideology narrative. And as you mentioned, it's even this notion of slavery, which let's just contrast again for a second, because we hear about Jamestown abolition of slavery, and people hear about in 1619, there was a shipload of slaves that arrived in Jamestown, and there's a lot more context to that. Because actually at the time, and we encourage people, when we say these kind of things, we say, hey, don't take my word for it. Look it up for yourself, right? Don't believe me. Be one of the Bereans from Acts 17, right? Don't trust me. Go look this up. Truth is not scared of being questioned.
That's right.
Right? It's only people that are lying that don't want to be questioned because they don't want to be exposed. Truth is not scared of questions. Don't trust me, go look it up. Slavery was illegal in Jamestown in 1619. The only thing that was legal was indentured servitude. Well, as an indentured servitude, there was a set number of years on that, and at the end of that set number of years, actually in the Jamestown colony at the time, after you'd been an indentured servant for several years, you were given a land grant where you became a free landowner in America. So all of those slaves that arrived in Jamestown became indentured servants. At the end of that time, they became free landowners, and actually many of them got married, had families, raised descendants that are still alive today, which again, there's a whole lot more to that story, but the reason I bring this up is because Jamestown and Plymouth were two different colonies that were very influential in American history. We talked about it yesterday. Well, that's when the first shipload of slaves, 1619, the first shipload of slaves arrived in Jamestown.
Well, let's qualify again. Those weren't really slaves. They were indentured servants.
Well, they were slaves, but not in Jamestown.
They didn't remain slaves when they got
right.
to Jamestown. So they were in a Portuguese slave vessel that they'd come off of Africa, and it was a Portuguese slave trading vessel. And the assumption is that slave trading vessel was going to Jamaica or Cuba or somewhere like that. There were two British privateer ships that attacked that Portuguese vessel.
So the slave ship was loaded with slaves bound for another place.
But once that slave ship was conquered by these two British they were privateer ships, they attacked the slave vessel. Then one of the ships took on approximately 19 slaves, and they took other spoils from this Portuguese ship. But the captain on the ship said, what are we going to do with these slaves? We need to unload them somewhere. Jamestown was the closest colony. They sailed to Jamestown, and they said, hey, we want to sell these slaves to you. And the people of Jamestown, the leaders of Jamestown said, well, we don't have slavery here. Like, that's not something we do yet. And they said, well, what do you have? Well, we have indentured servitude. He said, okay, well, I'll sell you indentured servants. So they were slaves. They became indentured servants. And then at the end of 7 years, they were given their freedom. And even today,
and land with the freedom, and that's really important.
And even today, people would say, but maybe they were treated really terribly for 7 years. Well, maybe they were treated terribly for 7 years. That's possible. We don't know how they were treated for 7 years. I will point out, though,
we aren't endorsing that, but there still is a huge difference between a 7-year indentured servant
and it's
a
worth
slave.
noting, had they gone to Jamaica or Cuba, the average lifespan for slaves in Cuba and Jamaica was much less than 7 years. Like 1 to 3 years was the average lifespan of. Had they arrived, they would have been worked literally to death. They might have been killed when they were down there. Jamestown would have been the best possible scenario. And again, I'm not endorsing, I'm not condoning.
Sure.
I'm not in favor, but just honestly
But it is important that people recognize that slavery was universal.
Right.
Well, let's also make a point, too, on indentured servant, because those indentured servants, those 19 that had been slaves became indentured servants. Nearly every other indentured servant in Jamestown was white. So it was not something they just did to blacks. They did whites. And give an example. Let's say I want to go to Mars, or I want to go to the moon with SpaceX. SpaceX is going to be flying people to the moon, and I don't know, it's going to cost me $1 million. And I go, well, I don't have a free million, but when I work hard, I think I'm worth $100,000 a year. I'll work 10 years for you if you'll pay for me to go to the moon. That's an indentured servant.
That's what it is.
Somebody's just fronting you a loan for you to get there. And nearly all of Virginia was populated with indentured servants that were white that wanted to come from Europe there. So it's not like these 19 black indentured servants were treated differently than anybody else.
necessarily that we know.
That's
Again,
right. That's
we can
right.
leave the caveat out that we don't know, but here's the important contrast. That's Jamestown. Let's go to Plymouth.
That's right.
Because we pointed out yesterday, Plymouth and Jamestown had very different legacies. If you go to Plymouth, there was a law passed in 1641 in Plymouth that said man stealing was illegal. And they defined man stealing as being taken from one continent, being put on a ship, sailed across the Great Sea to a new continent where you became a slave.
And they quoted Exodus 20 as the basis of why man stealing was a crime. So these are the people that are spending hours a day in the book, and they see what the book says, and the book says man stealing is a capital offense, and that's what they did.
So to take 1619 Jamestown and just ignore 1620 Plymouth is just totally picking and choosing.
Well, and this what becomes interesting is after Plymouth passed the law in 1641, in 1646 was when the first shipload of slaves arrived. And it was against the law for the slave trade to be going on in Plymouth. And presumably the captain didn't know that, but he arrives with slaves to this new colony. He's going to sell them. The people of Plymouth found out what was happening, and they went down to the port. They arrested the captain. They arrested the crew. They freed all of the slaves. They charged the captain and the crew with the crime of man stealing. And actually, the captain and the crew ended up being released because they said, we didn't know that was against the law here. We're so sorry. And they said, okay, we're going to let you go. But the people of Plymouth took up a collection that they hired a ship, a captain and a crew, and they said, we want you to take these people who had been kidnapped back to wherever their home is, help get them home. The people of Plymouth actually paid to get them back home.
Wow.
Well, that was the first shipload of slaves that arrived in Plymouth.
That's just totally different than anything you're hearing
See,
today.
what you get is the story of 1619, and it's not even an accurate story because 1619 is not the year. And you don't get the story of 1620, which is the better story because it had more of a lasting impact. We don't have slavery in America today. We do have liberty in America today. That came from the Pilgrims, not from Jamestown. And these guys are, and by the way, you mentioned the trained Marxism that was heading Black Lives Matter. Deal with Marxism, and people kind of understand that it's bad, but maybe not the concept. Their philosophy is fundamentally you get stronger by having continual fights. So if you can have two groups fighting, whichever one wins is strong. Then they need to fight some other group and they'll be stronger. And so fight.
Well, and let's clarify, it's not just two groups. In Marxism, there's only two classes.
Yeah.
It is the oppressed and the oppressors.
And that's the two groups they want fighting. It's the oppressed and the oppressed.
The oppressed always need to overthrow the oppressor. What's crazy, though, is in Marxism, they even point out sometimes the oppressed don't know they're in the oppressed class, so you have to teach them they're oppressed, and then you have to stir them up to rise up against the oppressor. And it's worth noting, Marxism is the ideology that in the 20th century alone is responsible for more than 100 million deaths. No ideology has killed more people than Marxism, and now you have literally the leaders of Black Lives Matter, which also is now you have leaders of critical race theory. You have leaders of the 1619 Project who all are promoting Marxist ideology. Marxism is responsible for the murders, the deaths of more people than anything else in the world. And in the midst of this, Marxism says you have an oppressed class and you have the oppressor class. And when Marx first did this, he did it on an economic perspective. It was a monetary theory, and it was that people who have money, they only got it by oppressing people who didn't have money. And so they said the people who don't have money, you need to rise up. And so this is really anti-capitalism too, but you need to rise up against that. This was tried in America. The problem was in America, it never took root because in America, there's too much economic fluidity where for all of us, I mean, we can look, his mom, my grandmother, was born in utter poverty. No electricity, no running water.
Outhouses, no indoor
right,
plumbing.
I mean, that's the way she grew up, and that was normal for her. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid in her house when it'd be the summer and she wouldn't be running the air conditioner because she thought, well, you don't need this. And we're like, Grandmama, yes, we need this. We're in Texas. It's 110 degrees outside. Yeah. But she had grown up she had grown up in utter poverty, and yet in a little over a generation, because of their work ethic, because of their character, because of the American system of the free market, they had achieved not just coming up out of poverty, they were in middle class and then upper middle class. In America, there was too much fluidity where everybody, even listening today, if they are in poverty, they can get out of poverty pretty quick in the American system. The Brookings Institute did a study, and they said if you were in poverty in America, there's only 3 things statistically it takes to get out of poverty in America. And that's for people born into poverty. They said if you will graduate high school, get a job, and don't have kids before you're married, 99% of people who do that get out of poverty in their lifetime.
Awesome.
So getting out of poverty is not hard to do in the American free market economic system.
So the Marxists had to change their thing. They couldn't put...
See, here's 1619 again, and notice what they say here. They said, in order to understand the brutality of American capitalism, the free market system, you have to start on the plantation. So that's that oppressed oppressor, and the only way you got money was you had to beat somebody else down to get it. So what happens with Marxism, they've been trying Marxism in America for 40, 50 years. And they want us to turn against our founders because you're not going to get rid of the Constitution unless you dislike the guys who wrote the Constitution. So you got to pillage them and make them really bad guys. And so they first start going after, well, these guys were all immoral, and that didn't fly. I mean, that was what was going on in the 80s and 90s, and people didn't buy that. And then they got into the thing, well, these guys are all atheists, agnostics, deists. And that didn't fly either. Now they're going, well, these guys were all racist, and this one's sticking. Because quite frankly, people in America don't want to be racist.
They don't like
racism.
We're helping it.
Well, we're going to kill it. But so far,
I understand what
it's
you're saying.
taken root and it's gone deeper than any of the others. That's all been Marxist philosophy to turn you against those who gave your nation, and then you have two classes fighting. And it's a weird philosophy because for them, to have that fight of oppressed and oppressor is what makes you strong. Jesus said a house divided won't stand. So Jesus says what they're doing will end in complete destruction. And it's interesting, they keep, I don't know, the logic is like the more divorces you have, the stronger your next marriage will be. No, that's not the way it works. And so they want more and more division, and then out of that division, they'll create another oppressed and oppressor, and out of that, they'll create another, and that's what makes the nation strong. That is such a lying philosophy. It is so anti-biblical. It has never worked in the history of mankind. As Tim said, it's produced more death, destruction, and devastation than any other philosophy, and that's what we're embracing right now, but part of it's because we don't recognize what it is.
So let's go back to America being systemically racist. You're showing that there's Jamestown and Plymouth. And how about some of the founding fathers, like the people who wrote the Constitution and people like this? They were slave owners. So does that prove that they were racist?
This is what we have fun with, because there's about 250 folks we call founding fathers. You got 56 who signed the Declaration, 55 who wrote the Constitution, 90 who did the Bill of Rights. Then you throw in important governors like Patrick Henry or John Jay or others. You throw in the original Supreme Court. So you got about 250 guys you can say are founding fathers. Someone says, well, they're all founding fathers. Name them. How
they're
many
all
can
racist.
you name? They're all excuse me. They're all slave owners. We say, okay, name the ones who owned slave. Washington and Jefferson. Come on, there's 250. If they're all, you got a lot to go. Give me 10 that own slave. Give me 15. Can't do it. We've never had anybody, and we do the same thing with the founding fathers who are all atheists, agnostics, deists. Okay, tell me which ones were. And they get 3 or 4 or 5, and it's the same 3, 4, or 5. Well, and on that they say, because these 5 did it, everybody else did it, and that's a bad assumption.
And it's worth noting that if we look back at the founding fathers, it's true that at some point in their life, the vast majority of founding fathers did at some point own slaves. Now, not all of them did, but we often learn history in generalizations and broad accusations. When someone says all of the founding fathers were racist slaveholders, right? I say, well, okay, tell me about John Adams. Tell me about Sam Adams. Let me just go through a list of people who never owned slaves and fought against slavery their whole life. They don't fit in that category. But then you have people like Benjamin Franklin. Mm-hmm. Benjamin Franklin was a slave owner, except no historian considers Franklin a racist. Why? Because Franklin not only freed his slaves, Franklin works to end slavery in America. Franklin actually advocates that one of the reasons we needed to separate from Great Britain was because the king was striking down our anti-slavery laws that were passed while we were still British colonists. And then Franklin ends up becoming the president of an anti-slavery society in Pennsylvania.
And Pennsylvania is one of those called Pennsylvania in 1773. Now, we didn't separate from Great Britain and become America until 1776. So Pennsylvania is a royal colony in 1773. That's where Franklin lives. And in 1773, they passed an anti-slavery law and the king struck it down. Massachusetts passed an anti-slavery law in 1773. The king struck it down. You have Connecticut. You have all these states that passed anti-slavery laws. The king struck them down. That was actually one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, is we've been trying to end slavery and this dude won't let us. Every time we pass an anti-slavery law, he vetoes it. So Franklin actually owned a slave in Pennsylvania. So did Benjamin Rush in Pennsylvania. When they got out from under the British crown, they freed their slaves, and they both become co-founders of the first anti-slavery society in America.
So I've heard that the King of England was actually a part owner in one of the slave trades.
Yes.
So he was definitely pro-slavery.
Correct. He had interest in the slave trade going on, if you look at the history of England, in all of their colonies where the old adage that the sun would never set on the British empires, because they had conquered so much of the world, and slavery was part of what they did in all of their colonies around the world. That was part of who they were and what they did, which is why when Americans were saying, we don't want slavery, the king said, you can't stop that. It's part of the British colonies, part of the British system.
So you were mentioning Pennsylvania in the 1700s, but I've heard that in the 1680s or something that Pennsylvania actually started abolitionist movements.
Yes, there were.
So this is 100 years before this.
Right. There was a group of Quakers back in the late 1600s in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was largely a Quaker colony, going back to William Penn, who was a Quaker in England, who's the founder of Pennsylvania. And you had Quakers who, fundamentally, there were two things Quakers were always against: war and slavery. That's just part of what you see when you study the Quakers and their history. And so knowing that this is a colony founded by Quakers and knowing that they're against war and against slavery, it absolutely makes sense and stands to reason that they were against slavery from all the way back in their very beginning. And it's true when you study the history of Pennsylvania. Now, going back even to the Founding Fathers, the reason this matters is if you look, for example, at the signers of the Declaration, there were 56 signers of the Declaration, and it's argued that, well, approximately 40 of those guys at some point in their life owned slaves. Well, that's true. But what people never seem to talk about is how many of those guys actually freed the slaves in their lifetime, or began speaking out against slavery, or helped found or start abolition societies, helped fund and work for abolition societies. We never hear the rest of the story of like the Benjamin Franklins freeing their slave, or the Benjamin Rush freeing their slaves. Or this is a really interesting lithograph.
There was a definite change in America towards slavery once we got out from under the British Empire. And so Massachusetts is a state that in 1773 said, we've had it, here's an anti-slavery law. The king says, no, you're going to keep it. So when we separated, Massachusetts becomes the first state in the United States to totally ban slavery. End it, straight out. This is a piece that ran in a newspaper. This is 1792. This is called the Equality Ball. This is John Hancock, who's governor of Massachusetts, who is anti-slavery, and beside him is Paul Cuff. Paul Cuff is the wealthiest black businessman in America. He has businesses in numerous states across the United States.
A black man that was...
Black man, the business owner.
And what date would that have been?
This happened in 1792, but he was a business owner well before that. 1780, he already had a very prosperous business. And so this is the other reason part of 1619 stands is people don't know enough black history to rebut that. And if you start going through Paul Cuff and James Fortin and all these other names I can throw out that were very prosperous, wealthy businessmen in this system. So what you have here, this is called the Equality Ball. John Hancock sponsored this ball to show blacks and whites are equal here in Massachusetts. There never was, there's a guy in the Civil War, his name is John Hancock. He's a colonel in the Union Army from Pennsylvania, not the same John Hancock, but he points out historically there never was a time in Massachusetts when blacks couldn't vote. So from the very, very beginning, blacks and whites were equal in Massachusetts.
Man, this is radically different than all of the stuff that we hear.
And that's why you will never see a picture like this in the 1619 Project, because it undermines their narrative. Now, there's bad stuff that happened in Jamestown, no question, but there's a lot of good stuff that they'll never tell you about, and you got to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly, and this is part of the good.
And I know that one of the articles that you wrote and put in our Thanksgiving newsletter was something about, you'll have to correct me, but there was 90-something% of the northern states that had outlawed slavery or resisting?
So by 1804, every northern state had passed a law for the abolition of slavery. But when you look...
and by the way, that included New York, that included New Jersey and other states that are not necessarily northern states. So the northern states tend to be the Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, all those guys.
But some of those laws were done for the gradual emancipation so that whenever a slave family had a child, that all the children would be free. So you could maintain the slaves you had, but then you couldn't get any new slaves, and their kids weren't slaves, and it wasn't inherited anymore. What's interesting, though, is I think the number you're looking at, I think it was by about 1810, it was about 99% of the former slaves in the northern colonies had been freed, and there was almost no vestige of slavery left in the northern colonies because of those anti-slavery laws that were passed.
You look at the census, I think it's 1790. There's just a dozen slaves in some states, and the largest slave owner would own 6 slaves, and that was half the slaves in the state. I mean, it was just a tiny percentage, tiny amount of slaves left in the northern states.
This is radically different than what we're hearing. So that's the reason we're doing these programs, is because we've got to change the narrative. They've been lying about things. We're coming up on Thanksgiving, and so many people have been told that there's nothing to be thankful for, that America is totally racist, systemically racist, which is an absolute lie. And we've already dealt with this a couple of days, and we're going to get back into it again today. But you know, we've been talking about the Founding Fathers. Just so many lies, it's hard to counter them all, but they've been saying that they're all racist, that they were all slave owners. David made a great point that there's only really a few of them that were slave owners, and then most of those actually fought to end slavery, but it was the culture of that day. Like, if I'm not mistaken, you guys are the experts, so you correct me, but George Washington was given a slave, I think, when he was 10 years old. He grew up with it. This is the thing. And they actually Again, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I got this from you guys, that George Washington and George Mason in the 1760s actually petitioned the British government to try and end slavery, and it was disapproved. Is that correct?
Yeah, Washington was a long-time anti-slavery guy, and he did inherit not just one, but a bunch of slaves when he was preteen and teen. And so he inherited a number of slaves, and probably the most onerous slave laws in America came out of Virginia. In Virginia, Jefferson inherited slaves as well. George Washington marries Martha. Martha had slaves, and those slaves that brought into the marriage by the wife are called dower slaves. And under state law, you can never free those slaves, ever. She can't free them, he can't free them. They have to stay slaves and be passed down generation to generation, can never be freed.
Now, this was before the American.
This was before the American.
This was British colony.
This was Virginia colony law. This is not the state. So Washington.
Well, those laws stayed in effect after the Revolution as well.
They did.
It's what's interesting in one of the contrasts between Jamestown and Plymouth. We talked about there's two primary colonies, and they both left different legacies. You see this in some of the southern states and the laws they passed, even protecting or preserving the institutes of slavery. It's where Virginia becomes very interesting, because most people that will point out a founding father that owned slaves, they know a founding father that had slaves, they'll point to a founding father from Virginia.
That's right.
Because they were some of the most prominent founding fathers, and most of the guys from Virginia at some point did own slaves. And it's interesting that even though you have these major leaders from Virginia who owned slaves, virtually every single founding father from Virginia spoke out against slavery. Talked about how it needed to end, it needed to stop, this was evil, it was a bad practice. And so you have guys like George Mason, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all of them advocating for the end of slavery in Virginia, and yet they couldn't get enough of the state legislature in Virginia to side with them to actually pass those laws in Virginia to follow suit of what the northern colonies were already doing. When you already had Massachusetts in 1780 or Vermont in 1777, when you can go through the northern states and see all of them passing anti-slavery laws, the southern states did not follow suit. And so even though many founding fathers in the South had sentiments that were very anti-slavery, the laws in their state forbid them. And Thomas Jefferson's a great example, because people point to Jefferson and say, well, but Jefferson, for example, in the Declaration wrote that all men are created equal. And people today say, but he could have meant all men because he had slaves. And you point out, no, wait a second, go back and read his original draft of the Declaration, because in the original draft, he actually did point out that what was happening with slavery in America, specifically the slave trade, was very wrong, because you were taking people who he identified, he said these were men, and when he wrote men, he wrote the capital M, capital E, capital N. It's the only word that was in full caps in the entire Declaration except...
And that's because pro-slavery people said they're not men, they're animals, they're brutes, they're below subhuman. And that was one of the ways they condoned up here slavery is, these aren't men. Well, Jefferson goes against that.
And it was the only word fully capitalized in the Declaration except for the United States of America was also fully capitalized. So only our nation was capitalized, but also he's identifying the humanities in these individuals. And so Jefferson identified, when he said that all men are created equal, he identified who the men were, and that was everybody.
So can you actually read, I've got a copy here, but I imagine you guys can quote it. What did he write in the Declaration? One of the grievances. I think there was, 38 grievances?
There was 27 grievances. 27 in the final copy. There were more than that, and one of them was the longest one, and it was this anti-slavery, anti-slave trade grievance that Jefferson had, and it did not make the final cut because wisely John Hancock said, okay guys, here's the deal. If it's not unanimous, we're not putting it in, because if 10 of us are for it and 3 are against it, the British would go to you 3 and work against us. And if it's a 7-6 split, then the British go to the 6. And so we can't have any division. Everything we do has got to be unanimous. And so what they did was they voted on every single grievance. And if it didn't get 13 out of 13, it didn't go in. The grievance about slavery got 11 out of 13. It got a whole lot. And that kind of tells you where the tone of the Founding Fathers were. When everybody says, oh, they're a bunch of racists, well, then how come 11 of 13 states voted on this clause against slavery, against the slave trade? And Jefferson lamented. He lamented very strongly that if it had not been for South Carolina and Georgia, if it hadn't been for those 2 states, it would have gone through. And later in life, actually, even before he wrote the Declaration, and back up a minute because you were talking about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, as you pointed out, so many of the Founding Fathers of Virginia owned slaves and didn't like slavery, which is a real oxymoronic thing. the state legislature was very strongly pro-slavery. And so Jefferson, when he became a legislator in the 1760s, introduced bills to end slavery, and they just about chased him out of the building for introducing the bill. I mean, they were really hostile to it. So Jefferson...
So could he not have gotten rid of his slaves? Was it against the law?
Here's what happened with Jefferson. Jefferson was in debt $2.5 million in debt back then.
That's not adjusted?
And he inherited that from his father-in-law.
I think that is adjusted, though. You're saying
it is adjusted, $2.5 million.
That would be in today's money.
That's today's money, which that's still a big debt.
Yeah.
And so that's today's money. His father-in-law, he inherited that. He had to pay off the debt. Then Jefferson made loans for the American Revolution and lost 99% of the loans he made. So he's in big debt. And the Virginia law says you cannot free any slave if you're in debt, because we can take that slave and sell it and get money to pay off your debts, collateral. And so he's not allowed to free any slave he's got, and he is one of the loudest voices for freeing slaves in that era. He actually wrote to France. He took Benjamin Banneker as a great black founding era guy. He's a black scientist. He's the first guy to do an almanac by a black American. Just brilliant. He helped lay out D.C. Thomas Jefferson chose him to help lay out the city of Washington, D.C. as a black man. And so Jefferson took his almanac and sent it to France. And France said, you guys are trying to fight slavery. Anybody who says that a black is not as smart as a white, you give them Benjamin Banneker's almanac. This guy has predicted solar eclipses so far out in the future. He's predicted recurring locust plagues every 17 years. You show them this and show them how smart blacks are. So Jefferson worked across the world in ending slavery. It's interesting, one of Washington's generals, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, came here to fight in the Revolution. He was from Lithuania, and he was a rich nobleman. And when he died, he gave all of his money to Jefferson and said, hey, I know you hate slavery. You take this and use it to fight slavery, use it to end slavery. So Jefferson has all these world connections, but Jefferson could not free his own slaves. But interestingly, he's trying state legislatures. In 1784, he actually introduced a law in the National Congress to end slavery in all the states, and it failed by one vote. Came within one vote, and Jefferson did that. So there's a book that's come out this year that it's an interesting title. It calls Jefferson the First Emancipationist, and that's got to drive,
well,
radicals
could I get
crazy.
you guys to read this? If you can't quote it, this is your article, but this is what Jefferson wrote in the original draft of the or is it the Declaration?
Declaration. And there's a little more. But this is the beginning of it. It says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself.
He being King George.
Right? Violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, and infidel is underlined, is the piratical warfare of the Christian king, and Christian king is also underlined.
So King George III claims to be a Christian, but he's acting like an infidel, is the point.
This Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce.
In other words, he's vetoed every law we pass against slavery.
And this was the grievance that Jefferson put in there. And it's also worth noting, even when we look at the Northwest Ordinance, which I think we mentioned a couple days ago, the Northwest Ordinance said every new territory that comes in has to come in as an anti-slavery state. The wording they used for the Northwest Ordinance was actually something Jefferson had written against slavery. And so literally verbatim, they've taken Jefferson's writing and put it in the Northwest Ordinance to say we're not having slavery in any of the new territories. Jefferson was known by almost all former generations as being an anti-slavery guy, even though, right, you're looking and seeing, okay, wait a second. Like, this dude clearly had slaves, but I would point out, it's interesting how disconnected we are from biblical truth when we look at American history. Because King David was called a man after God's own heart. And King David was certainly not a perfect man. And we look back at like Washington or Jefferson, and we see imperfections. We see sinful fleshly moments.
Well, could you compare it today to like abortion? We say that we're pro-life, and yet there are abortion laws, and there are, 70 plus million
I use
kids.
that same example because there's going to be a future generation that looks back and said, you were pro-abortion because you lived in a nation that allowed abortion.
That's right.
You're not pro-abortion.
That's right.
Or we even go to the point that today so many people use smartphone technology when, for the iPhone, for example, or some of these Nike products, so many of these things that people buy and use today are made by literal slaves over in China or other places around the world. And we say, oh no, we're anti-slavery, but you're buying things made in slave markets. This is one of those things that...
So one of the problems is being 45 years removed from all of this. We don't understand the context that there was no place on the planet that there wasn't slavery. There were laws. These people could not get rid of it. And yet our founding fathers fought against slavery.
The founding fathers were the first cohesive group of national leaders to start fighting slavery. Nowhere in the world did you have
We started the anti-slavery movement.
And if they had just said, all right, unless Georgia and South Carolina, sign this thing, then if they had just said, all right, well, then we won't rebel, well, they wouldn't have even laid the seeds of freedom. It was a compromise, but they at least laid the seeds of freedom that later brought about an end to slavery.
And the Declaration of Independence was the first document in the world that claimed this incredible notion that all men are equal. Because in the world at that time, it was largely ruled by kings. And the kings had his nobles, right? And you had serfs and you had peasants. And there wasn't equality in the world. This was a crazy thought. This was the first governing document in the history of the world to espouse the notion that all people could be equal. And literally, the Declaration was the foundation that was used in the rest of the world. When you look at England ending the slave trade with William Wilberforce, the guy leading that charge, William Wilberforce was in direct connection with a lot of leaders in America and was influenced by that notion of the Declaration that all men are created equal. Genuinely, it is honest and true to say that America laid the foundation for the anti-slavery movement around the world. And it's also fair to say the founding fathers, man, they weren't perfect. And we're saying the vast majority of them were anti-slavery. That's true. There, of course, were some founding fathers who were pro-slavery, and we know them. We can list their names.
We can list more than the other side can. I mean, they don't even know who the real pro-slavery founding fathers are.
And this is the point that's important to note is that, right, when we look at some of the accusations made against America today, and even as we're getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, and people are saying, well, you can't celebrate Thanksgiving because look at all the bad America's done. It's true, there have been a lot of bad moments in American history. That is unquestionable. And when people argue
such as today, the way we're leaving Afghanistan, but does that make all of us in agreement with the policies that are done?
And you've mentioned several times, like even systemic racism. It's true that in American history, there were times when there were systems of racism, like slavery. That's a system of racism. Sure it was.
It's human nature. It's not American or anything. It's just human nature to oppress people.
But the point that's worth making is America participated in the same evils that everywhere else in the world did. And yet America put a stop to those evils sooner than anywhere else in the world. And it was because of Christians who understood the principles of the Word of God, right? This goes back to the foundation of Plymouth, where these were people who studied the Word of God, who wanted to apply it to their life. And there's actually a lot of stuff we can get into to talk about the foundations of Plymouth and what they actually did, what they gave to America that came from the roots, the principles of Christianity. But it was always, every time someone wants to talk about how bad America was, I always want to ask just very simple questions. You name any grievance you want in American history, and I'm going to ask one question. How or why did that end in America? Because slavery ended, right? You could talk about some of the Jim Crow laws. They ended with the Civil Rights era. How did those things end? And you pick any atrocity you want. It doesn't matter. You pick any atrocity. How did those end? And I will point out, without exception, it was always the pastors, the Christians, the churches, those spiritual leaders in America who knew what the Word of God said, saying, we have to stop this in America. One of the reasons America's been the most stable, the most prosperous, the most blessed nation in the history of the world has been because of the impact of Christianity in this nation. And the more our nation struggles, it's a reflection that we are lacking those principles of Christianity, the application, or sometimes even we're lacking the spiritual leadership of pastors around the nation standing up saying, guys, we shouldn't be doing this. And this is one of the things that even when we talk about the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving, absolutely we should be thankful for this nation because no nation has brought more freedom, more prosperity, more stability in the world. And right now, again, genuinely, America's not been a perfect nation. We can go back to the 1619 Project, and there are some things that they say in there, some things that are true. Now, the vast majority of what they claim is not historically founded.
Part of the narrative they've got, too, is going back to the Marxist thing we talked about yesterday of oppressed and oppressors sitting in the two groups. And right now, it's really black and white. They have made it a color issue. Now, biblically, God doesn't see color. God doesn't look on the outside, he looks on the inside. With him, there's neither Jew nor Greek, Scythian nor free. I mean, he sees all men the same. It's the inside he sees. These guys are fixated on the outside, and even there, they totally miss the narrative. At the time Columbus landed in the New World, between 20 and 40% of Native Americans in North America were enslaved by other Native Americans. And that's not white and black. And so then...
So what would the percentage be like, for instance, of slaves in the early colonies versus Indians having slaves?
And that's an interesting question, because when you look at the early colonies, let's take, for example, a guy who's the father of black history. And so the father of black history in 1830 looked at the 1830 census, early colonies, and he did this in 1930. He published a book in 1930 or 31, thereabouts, and he looked back 100 years. He said he went through the census, and so the father of black history said he found that in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks, not enslaved, but free blacks, 43% of free blacks owned black slaves in South Carolina. And 40% of free blacks in Georgia, and so there was a high percentage. Now, granted, there were more whites than blacks, and more slaves were owned by whites than blacks, but still, it's not just white on black. And then in the 1860 census, the federal government points out that at that time, as you look at all the slave population, about 8% of America was slaves. So 92% of America was not slave. In the South, it was higher. It was about somewhere around 20-25%. So overall nation, overall South, it's worse there. But the highest percentage slave owners in America were Native Americans owning black slaves. The 5 major Native American tribes in 1860, 1 out of every 8 members of the Native American tribe was a black slave. So even the white on black doesn't hold up. What you got to have is human on human. That's what holds up. The sin nature holds up, and so it's not a color issue.
So I don't want to throw you guys off, but could you go back to like Anthony Johnson? This goes back into the 1630s, if I'm not mistaken, and he was the first legal slave owner for life.
What's interesting, we talked about the indentured servants, the 19 slaves that arrived in Jamestown that became indentured servants. And not all 19 names are known, but one of the individuals that some people think actually was one of those original 19 was a guy named Anthony Johnson. What we do know is that Anthony Johnson was a black man who came to America, became an indentured servant. And at the end of 7 years, he was given freedom, became a landowner, actually got married, raised a family.
Wasn't it like over 100 acres he was?
250.
Yeah.
Yes, and actually his wealth was growing, and he decided that he wanted to help indentured servants, so he would pay to bring people in, and they would work for him for 7 years, and they would help grow his economy, right? Grow his productivity of what they were doing. And one of the guys that he indentured was a guy named John Kaser. John Kaser was another black man who had come to America. And apparently John Kaser was not the most productive, was not the hardest worker. At least that's part of the accusation against him. And Anthony Johnson was so displeased with John Kaser, they had a very rough relationship. At the end of 7 years, John Kaser's indenture was done, but Anthony Johnson was so frustrated that he said, I'm going to take you to court and I'm going to sue to have you for the rest of your life. Well, John Kaser, being a little nervous what was going to happen, John Kaser went to a white man and said, hey, will you please indenture me? I want to work for you so I have some level of protection because I'm scared of what Anthony Johnson might try to do to me. So John Kaser went and indentured himself for another 7 years. And actually, even this notion of continuing to indenture yourself was not unfounded, because if you're working for somebody, they're taking care of your room and your board, right? There are levels of security.
You're getting free education, you're getting school, training, apprenticeship.
Sounds like welfare today.
Well, except maybe there's a level of requirement.
But it wasn't government involved.
A level of requirement, because you were required to go do labor. You were required to go do work. And so John Kaser indentures himself to this white family, but Anthony Johnson's able to take him to court. And when he got to court, he presented before a white judge and said, this man for the last several years have done nothing really to benefit me. And the judge agreed, seeing how unproductive John Kaser was. And so Anthony Johnson and the judge negotiated and agreed that John Kaser would become a slave for the rest of his life to Anthony Johnson to pay off the debt that was owed.
And just to be clear, Anthony Johnson's a black man, John Kaser's a black man.
And this was the first case of chattel slavery in America. And chattel slavery slavery was legal in America prior to this under primarily 2 conditions. Either under just war, which for the history of the world, right? I mean, back in the 1600s, go back forever. If you were a people conquering or attacking another people, if one people conquers another people, at the end of that war, there's only 2 options for the survivors. You either kill them or you enslave them.
And that's the story of the Old Testament. I mean, that's what David's men did. That's what the Canaanites did. That's what the Egyptians did. Every nation did.
That was the history of the world. So that was one option. The second thing is that if you committed a crime, they would imprison you, and they called it a limited slave ship where you were enslaved for like 20 years, but it was different because they would put you like breaking rocks or building roads or chopping down trees. So it was hard labor, but at the end of your 20 years of hard labor, and whatever it was, it might have been 5 years, 10 years, but at the end of hard labor, you were freed. So slavery was legally under those two conditions. This was the first time in American history that you could legally enslave someone that you had not conquered in a justified war or that had not committed a crime. This was just because the other man, some judge ruled that you could own him for the remainder of his life. And that is where chattel slavery started in America, was 1653, where a black man owned another black man for the remainder of his life.
So slavery, legal slavery where you owned a person for the rest of their life, was actually started by black on black.
It was.
That was the first legal case in the American colonies.
I tell you, this is awesome. This is awesome. And again, nobody here is promoting slavery, but we're trying to put everything into its context and let people recognize that the way they're saying America is systemically racist is a lie. Mm-hmm. America is systemically anti-racist. We are the ones that started sowing these seeds.
Yes.
It is systemically human, which means you have sin involved.
That's right.
But it's not racist, it's human.
Man, that's awesome. I hope that the people watching this are being blessed by this. This is one of the reasons I wanted the Bartons to come on, is because, man, we need to be praising God for this nation. We've had forefathers that have put their life on their line, their liberty, their finances, everything, and they are getting a bad rap today. They are being lied about. And so I believe that at Thanksgiving, we need to be giving praise to God for this nation and for the people who founded it. And so that's the reason that we've had them come on.